The last ranger of the Appalachians. The silent outpost. The air in the Appalachian Mountains doesn't just feel cold, it feels heavy, as if the oxygen itself is saturated with the weight of 1,000 years of secrets. My name is Elias, and tonight I am the only soul within 40 miles of this ridge. My new home is a weathered cedar log cabin perched like a nervous bird on the edge of a limestone cliff. They call this place Outpost 4, but the locals down in the valley, the few who still live there, call it the Watchman's Grave. I didn't ask why when I took the job. I just needed the silence. The drive up here was a journey through a changing world. As the paved roads dissolved into gravel and the gravel into red Appalachian dirt, the modern world seemed to peel away like old paint. The towering hemlocks and ancient oaks closed in behind my truck, their branches interlocking like the fingers of a giant, locking the gate to civilization. By the time I reached the outpost, the sun was a dying ember behind the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to reach for my tires. The cabin smells of pine resin, old tobacco, and something else, something metallic, like the scent of rain hitting a hot radiator. It's a small space, a single bed with a wool blanket, a cast-iron stove that looks like a squatting beast in the corner, and a heavy oak desk scarred with the knife marks of previous rangers. Above the desk hangs a window that looks out into the absolute blackness of the forest. There are no city lights here, no humming of electricity, only the sound of your own heartbeat, which feels uncomfortably loud in the stillness. I spent the first hour lighting the stove. The wood was dry, and as the flames took hold, the shadows in the room began to dance. This is the part they don't tell you about in the training manuals, the way the light creates shapes in the corners of your eyes. You find yourself turning your head quickly, thinking you saw someone standing by the door, only to find nothing but the heavy coat you brought with you. I sat down at the desk and opened the official logbook. The last entry was dated 3 months ago. It was written in a hurried, shaky hand. The wind is speaking in his voice again. I told them I wouldn't open the door. I told them the hinges are weak. If you are reading this, don't look at the pines when the moon is full. I ran my fingers over the ink. It felt cold. Rangers are known for being lonely, and loneliness breeds strange thoughts. But there was a raw desperation in those words that made the hair on my arms stand up. Dinner was a simple tin of beans heated on the stove. I ate in silence, staring at the window. As the moon began to rise, the forest transformed. The Appalachians are old, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps. These mountains have seen the rise and fall of species we have no names for. And tonight, looking at the silver light bathing the trees, I felt like a trespasser. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a sharp, rhythmic tink, tink, tink against the glass of the window. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. My mind raced through logical explanations. A branch? No, there are no trees close enough to touch the glass. A bird? Not at this hour. I slowly stood up, the floorboards screaming under my boots. Every muscle in my body was tight, ready to bolt, but my curiosity, that fatal human flaw, pushed me toward the glass. I cupped my eyes around my eyes to block the interior light and pressed my face against the cold pane. At first, I saw nothing but my own pale reflection. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the moonlight, I saw it. On the narrow ledge outside the window, there were 3 small, perfectly round stones. They were white, gleaming like pearls against the dark wood. Someone or something had placed them there. I stepped back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I looked at the door. It was bolted with a heavy iron bar, but suddenly that bar felt as thin as a toothpick. I remembered the logbook's warning, "Don't open the door." I reached for my radio, the plastic cold and reassuring in my hand. I clicked the receiver. "Base, this is Elias at Outpost 4. Do you copy?" Static, just a wall of white noise that sounded like 1,000 whispering voices. "Base, this is Outpost 4. I have an animal or someone outside. Please acknowledge." The static shifted. The pitch changed, becoming a low melodic hum. And then, through the speaker, I heard a voice. It was faint, distorted by miles of mountain interference, but it was unmistakable. It was my own voice. "Elias, the stones are a gift. Why won't you come out and play?" I dropped the radio on the floor. It clattered, the battery popping out, plunging the room back into that suffocating silence. I sat back on the bed, pulling the wool blanket around my shoulders. The fire in the stove was dying, the orange embers fading into gray ash. I didn't want to look at the window again, but I could feel those 3 white stones sitting there, watching me. Outside, the wind began to pick up, moaning through the hemlocks. It sounded like a choir of the lost, rising from the valleys and up the ridges. I realized then that I wasn't here to watch the forest. The forest was here to watch me. I am the last ranger of the Appalachians, but as the first night deepens, I wonder if I am the watcher or the prey. I laid down, not to sleep, but to wait. In the Appalachians, the night doesn't end when the sun comes up. It only hides under the leaves, waiting for the next person brave or foolish enough to seek the silence. I closed my eyes, but all I could see were those 3 white stones, and all I could hear was my own voice calling to me from the dark. The missing map. The sun didn't so much rise the next morning as it did simply dissolve the darkness into a thick, milky fog. In the Appalachians, the mist is a living thing. It clings to the hollows and wraps around the trunks of the ancient trees like a damp shroud. I woke up still sitting against the headboard of the bed, my muscles stiff and my eyes burning from a night of half-sleep. My first instinct was to look at the window. The 3 white stones were gone. There were no marks on the ledge, no signs of footprints in the soft morning dew outside, just the empty gray void of the mountain air. I spent the morning trying to convince myself that the radio incident was just a glitch, a strange atmospheric phenomenon known to happen in these high altitudes. But deep down, in that primal part of the brain that doesn't listen to logic, I knew better. My own voice had spoken to me, and it hadn't sounded like a recording. It had sounded like an invitation. After a strong cup of black coffee that tasted like wood smoke, I decided to do a full inventory of the cabin. If I was going to survive the next 6 months here, I needed to know every inch of this outpost. I started with the heavy oak desk. The drawers were filled with the usual ranger equipment: old batteries, dried-out pens, a rusted multi-tool, and stacks of official report forms that hadn't been touched in years. But as I pulled the bottom drawer completely out of its track, I noticed something stuck to the underside of the desk frame. It was a bundle of oilcloth tied tightly with a piece of frayed leather cord. My heart hammered against my ribs as I untied it. Inside was a hand-drawn map, far more detailed than the official topographical charts provided by the Forest Service. The paper was yellowed and brittle, smelling of damp earth and old secrets. This wasn't just a map of the ridges and valleys. It was a map of things that weren't supposed to be there. The map covered the 10-mile radius around Outpost 4, but it was covered in strange, handwritten annotations in dark red ink. In one area, near the Blackwood Creek, there was a circle with the words, "The place where silence breathes." Further north, near a jagged peak called Widow's Peak, the mapmaker had written, "Do not look up. They are in the canopy." But what caught my eye the most was a small shaded area labeled the Dead Zone, an area where the contour lines of the mountains simply stopped, leaving a blank white space in the middle of the dense forest. As I studied the map, I realized that some of the trails drawn on it didn't exist on my official GPS. They were old trails, perhaps used by the Cherokee centuries ago, or by the early settlers who tried and failed to tame these ridges. One of these ghost trails started right behind my cabin. According to the map, it led directly to an old abandoned surveyor's hut near the edge of the dead zone. I knew it was a risk. The fog was still thick, and the forest was a labyrinth, but the mystery of the missing stones and the radio voice was eating me alive. I packed my gear, a flashlight, a heavy knife, a compass, and the mysterious map, and stepped out of the cabin. The moment I stepped off the porch, the forest seemed to change. The birds which had been chirping moments ago went silent. The only sound was the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. I followed the compass heading indicated on the oilcloth map. About 50 yards behind the cabin, I found it. A faint indentation in the earth, almost completely overgrown with mountain laurel and briars. It was the trail. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to grow taller, their branches knitting together so tightly that even the midday sun couldn't penetrate the canopy. The air grew colder, and the silence became heavy, that same suffocating silence I had felt the night before. I kept checking the map. I was approaching the area marked as the place where silence breathes. I stopped when I reached a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient oak tree, its bark blackened as if struck by lightning, but it was still alive, its twisted limbs reaching out like desperate arms. Hanging from the branches were dozens of small handmade charms, crosses made of twigs, bundles of dried herbs, and small pouches of leather. They swayed slightly, though there was no wind. It looked like a shrine, or perhaps a warning. I reached out to touch one of the leather pouches, but a sudden sharp snap behind me made me spin around. I pulled my knife, my breath hitching in my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice didn't echo. It felt like the forest swallowed the sound as soon as it left my lips. There was no movement, no rustle of leaves, but then I noticed it. About 20 feet away, standing perfectly still between two thick pines, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in a tattered gray ranger uniform. For a second, I felt a surge of relief. Another human. "Hey, are you from base?" I called out, taking a step forward. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. As the mist shifted, I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there was only smooth gray skin, like a face that had been erased. The uniform it wore was old, the style they used back in the 70s, and the name tag on the chest was tarnished, but I could still make out the letters H.W. Walker. My stomach turned to ice. Henry Walker was the name of the ranger who had gone missing from Outpost 4 in 1978. He was never found. I didn't think. I ran. I turned and bolted back the way I came, my lungs screaming as I crashed through the underbrush. I didn't look back, but I could feel it behind me. Not the sound of footsteps, but a coldness, a pressure in the air that was gaining on me. I reached the cabin porch and scrambled inside, slamming the door and sliding the iron bar into place. I stood there, gasping for air, my back against the door. I looked down at the hand-drawn map still clutched in my trembling hand. I noticed something new, something I hadn't seen before. Near the cabin icon on the map, a new mark had appeared in that same dark red ink. It was a tiny drawing of a window, and outside that window were 3 small round circles. The map wasn't just a record of the past. It was updating. It was watching me. I sat at the desk, the fire in the stove long dead, and watched the fog press against the glass. Somewhere out there, the faceless man in the 1970s uniform was waiting, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that tomorrow I would have to go back out, because, according to the map, the dead zone is moving, and it's headed straight for my door. The Whispering Pines. The third day arrived with a silence that felt heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressed against my chest. In the Appalachians, silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a living entity that listens as much as it waits. I am Elias, the lone watcher of Outpost 4, and after the incident with the faceless ranger and the shifting map, my sanity felt as frayed as the old hemp ropes in the equipment shed. I stood on the porch, staring at the dense wall of pine trees that stood 50 yards away. They call this section the Whispering Pines, and today I understood why. The wind wasn't blowing, yet the tops of the pines were swaying in a rhythmic, deliberate motion. It looked like 1,000 skeletal hands waving in slow motion against the leaden sky. I checked the oilcloth map again. The red ink had formed a perfect circle around this grove, and inside that circle was a single word: listen. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. If the mountain wanted me, it would find a way inside. My only hope was to understand the rules of this place before I became another forgotten name in the logbook. I packed my rucksack with extra batteries, a flare gun, and a heavy iron hatchet. As I stepped off the porch, the air changed. The scent of pine was overwhelming, so thick it tasted like copper on the back of my tongue. I entered the grove, and immediately the world went dark. The canopy of the pines was so dense that it swallowed the daylight, leaving me in a perpetual emerald twilight. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled every footstep, making me feel like a ghost walking through a graveyard. Then the sound began. It started as a low hum, like a distant swarm of bees, but as I moved deeper into the grove, the hum fractured into thousands of distinct, tiny voices. They weren't speaking from the air, they were coming from the trees themselves. I pressed my ear against the bark of a massive ancient pine. The wood was vibrating. Inside, I could hear a muffled, distorted sobbing. It sounded like a woman calling for her child, her voice stretched and warped by the density of the timber. Elias. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice was clear, crisp, and it had come from a tree directly behind me. It was the voice of my mother, a woman who had been buried in a quiet New England cemetery 5 years ago. Elias, it's cold in the wood, the tree whispered, its bark shifting and cracking to form the vague shape of a mouth. The roots are so thirsty, Elias. Why won't you give us a drink? I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to remind myself of the hallucinations caused by high-altitude isolation, but the logic didn't hold. The scent of her perfume, lavender and old lace, was suddenly present in the air, clashing with the oppressive smell of pine. I turned to run, but the grove had shifted. The trail I had followed was gone. In its place stood a wall of identical trees, their branches interlocking like the bars of a cage. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of names and dates. I realized with a jolt of horror that these weren't just trees. Every single pine in this grove was a monument to a person who had vanished in these mountains. The whispering pines were the voices of the lost, trapped in the wood, their memories digested by the mountain and replayed on a loop for whoever was unfortunate enough to listen. I saw a flash of silver in the hollow of a nearby tree. I reached in, my hand trembling, and pulled out a tarnished metal object. It was a ranger's badge. I rubbed the dirt off the surface. H. Walker, 1978. Suddenly, the badge grew burning hot in my hand. I dropped it, and as it hit the ground, the whispering stopped. A dead, suffocating silence took over, and then, from the darkness of the grove, something began to move. It wasn't the faceless man. This was something larger, a mass of tangled roots and pine needles that stood 7 feet tall, its limbs cracking like breaking bone as it stepped toward me. It had no eyes, but it followed the sound of my panicked breathing. I pulled the flare gun from my belt and fired. The red phosphorus erupted in the gloom, illuminating the creature for a split second. It looked like a man made of rot and forest floor, his skin nothing but woven bark. The flare hit the ground near its feet, and the creature hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe. I didn't wait. I swung my hatchet at a low-hanging branch, carving a notch into the wood to mark my way. I ran blindly, swinging the hatchet at anything that touched me. The trees seemed to lean in, their needles scratching at my face like tiny needles. The voices returned, no longer whispering, but screaming my name in a chorus of agony. "Stay with us, Elias. The roots are lonely." I burst through the edge of the grove, tumbling onto the rocky soil of the clearing. I scrambled to my feet and didn't stop running until I was inside the cabin. The heavy iron bar slammed into place. I collapsed against the door, my chest burning, my face bleeding from a dozen tiny cuts. I looked at my hands. They were covered in a sticky amber resin that wouldn't wash off. I went to the mirror to wipe the blood from my face, but I stopped. In the reflection, behind my own terrified eyes, I could see the faint outline of pine needles beginning to grow under my skin, just beneath the surface of my cheeks. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. I survived the grove, but I brought a piece of it with me. The forest is no longer just outside my window. It's starting to grow inside my lungs. Every time I breathe, I can hear the faint, distant whisper of 1,000 lost souls, and tonight I realized that one of those voices is starting to sound exactly like mine. The mountain doesn't just take your life, it takes your voice, and I can feel the bark beginning to harden in my throat. The Forbidden Trail. The transformation of the forest was no longer a theory. It was an undeniable, cold reality. I woke up on the 4th day with a strange metallic taste in my mouth, and the skin on my forearms felt tight, almost like parchment. The scratches on the cabin door from the night before had formed a pattern, not a random animal's clawing, but a deliberate sequence of symbols that looked like a dead language. I didn't need a translator to know what they meant. They meant property of the rich. I sat at the heavy oak desk and unfolded the oilcloth map. The red ink had bled further across the paper, revealing a thin, jagged line that wasn't there yesterday. It cut through a section of the mountain known as the Shadow Basin, a place where the sun supposedly never touches the ground. This was the Forbidden Trail. In the official Forest Service records, this path had been struck from the books in 1944 after a group of surveyors went in and only their empty boots were found, lined up neatly at the trailhead. The air outside was thick enough to chew. A heavy gray fog had swallowed the peaks, leaving me in a world that felt like it was made of charcoal and ash. I checked my gear. My flashlight was flickering despite fresh batteries, a common occurrence when the mountain starts to feed. I grabbed my heavy weather jacket, gripped my axe, and stepped out into the mist. Finding the Forbidden Trail was easier than I expected. The forest seemed to open up for me, the ancient hemlocks leaning back like spectators at a funeral. The entrance to the trail was marked by 2 massive stones standing upright like a gateway. As I passed between them, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in thick plumes of white vapor. The silence here wasn't empty. It was pressurized. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. The trail was narrow, winding along the edge of a deep ravine. Below me, the mist swirled like a boiling cauldron, obscuring a drop that must have been hundreds of feet deep. I kept my eyes on the path, but the trees along the forbidden trail were different. Their branches didn't grow toward the sky. They grew downward, burrowing back into the earth, their roots exposed and twisting like petrified snakes. About an hour into the hike, I began to hear it. The sound of footsteps. Not behind me, but under me. Every time I took a step, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from deep within the earth, perfectly synchronized with my own pace. I stopped. The thudding stopped. I took a quick double step. Thud, thud. It was a mockery. Something was moving beneath the soil, tracking my vibration, following my heartbeat. I reached a section of the trail where the trees had been cleared away, leaving a barren patch of gray earth. In the center of the clearing stood an old wooden signpost, bleached white by decades of mountain winters. The sign didn't point toward a destination. It simply had one word carved into it in jagged, desperate letters. Turn. But I couldn't turn back. The trail behind me had vanished. When I looked over my shoulder, the path was gone, replaced by a wall of thorns and tangled briars that hadn't been there minutes ago. The forest had closed the door behind me. There was only one way to go, forward into the shadow basin. As I descended deeper into the basin, the light died completely. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam was weak, struggling to pierce the oppressive darkness. The trees here were draped in a strange pale moss that hung down like long, stringy hair. It brushed against my face, feeling cold and oily. And then the whispering started again. But it wasn't the collective drone of the pines. These were individual voices, clear, crisp, and terrifyingly familiar. "Elias, you're late for the shift," a voice whispered from the darkness to my left. It was the voice of my father, who had passed away 10 years ago. "Elias, the door is locked from the outside," a woman's voice whispered to my right, the voice of my high school sweetheart. I squeezed my eyes shut and kept moving. "It's an echo," I told myself. "The minerals in the mountain, the isolation, the lack of oxygen, it's all a hallucination." But then I saw him. Standing in the middle of the trail was a man. He was wearing a modern ranger's uniform, identical to mine. He was facing away from me, his head bowed. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who are you?" The man slowly began to turn. His movements were jerky, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. As he came into the light of my flickering flashlight, I felt the world tilt. It wasn't the faceless man from 1978. It was me. The figure standing on the forbidden trail had my face, my eyes, even the small scar on my chin. But his skin was the color of wet ash, and his eyes were completely white. No pupils, no irises. He opened his mouth, and instead of words, the sound of 1,000 cicadas screaming poured out. The ground beneath me began to shake. The thudding from below intensified, becoming a violent vibration that knocked me off my feet. The other me took a step forward, his movements becoming smoother, more natural. He was reclaiming the space I occupied. I scrambled to my feet, swung my axe at the air in front of me, and ran. I didn't follow the trail. I scrambled up the side of the ravine, digging my fingernails into the frozen dirt, ignored the thorns tearing at my skin. I climbed until my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. When I finally reached the top of the ridge and saw the silhouette of Outpost 4 in the distance, the sun was beginning to set. I burst through the cabin door and slammed the bar home. I didn't look at the map. I didn't check the radio. I crawled into the corner of the room, far away from the window, and clutched my axe to my chest. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in the pale, oily moss from the forbidden trail. I tried to wipe it off, but it wouldn't come away. It was sinking into my pores, turning my skin that same shade of wet ash. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. But as I listen to the scratching starting up again at the door, I realize that I am no longer sure which Elias is on the inside and which one is waiting on the forbidden trail to come home. The forest doesn't just want my life, it wants my place in the world. And tonight, I think the mountain is winning. The empty cabin. The fifth day arrived with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the cabin walls. The fog had retreated, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. I stood on the porch, watching the shadows of the hemlocks stretch across the clearing like skeletal fingers. My skin still felt tight, and the pale, oily residue from the forbidden trail had left faint silvery streaks on my arms that glowed dimly in the pre-dawn light. I knew I couldn't stay inside. The cabin, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a wooden cage. I checked the oilcloth map one more time. A new location had revealed itself, etched in that deep, visceral red ink: the shepherd's cabin. It was located in a valley so deep and narrow that the official maps simply marked it as inaccessible terrain. According to the old legends of the Blue Ridge, the shepherd wasn't a man who tended to sheep, but a man who tended to the things that wandered out of the dead zone. He had been gone for 80 years, yet the map insisted that his hearth was still warm. The hike down into the valley was a descent into another world. The air grew thick with the smell of wild ramps and rotting cedar. The descent was steep, requiring me to cling to roots and jagged limestone outcrops. As I reached the floor of the valley, the towering ridges on either side blocked out the sun, plunging the world into a perpetual twilight. There, nestled between two ancient lightning-scarred oaks, was the cabin. It was smaller than mine, built of rough-hewn stone and timber that had turned black with age. What struck me first was the door. It was wide open. In the wilderness, an open door is a death sentence for a structure. It invites the damp, the rot, and the animals. But as I stepped across the threshold, I didn't find a ruin. I found a home that looked as if the occupant had simply stepped out for a second to fetch water. A cast-iron kettle sat on the stone hearth, and though there was no fire, a faint wisp of steam rose from its spout. A plate of half-eaten bread sat on the heavy pine table, the crumbs still soft, not yet claimed by mold or insects. "Is anyone here?" I called out. My voice felt small, swallowed instantly by the heavy fabric of the shadows. There was no answer, but the house felt occupied. It had that specific vibration of a room where someone is watching you from just behind your field of vision. I moved toward the back of the cabin, where a small wooden cot was tucked into an alcove. Above the cot, the wall was covered in thousands of small, hand-carved wooden figurines. They were primitive, but hauntingly detailed. Each one represented a person, some in ranger uniforms, some in 19th century pioneer clothing, others in modern hiking gear. As I leaned in closer, my heart skipped a beat. Near the end of the row, there was a figurine that looked exactly like me. It wore my jacket, my boots, and even had the same desperate expression I had seen in the mirror this morning. But what was more terrifying was the figure next to mine. It was the faceless man from the 1970s. The figurines were holding hands, their wooden fingers intertwined. I backed away, my breath hitching in my chest. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on a loose floorboard near the hearth. It creaked loudly, and as it shifted, I saw a flash of white underneath. I knelt down and pried the board up. Hidden in the dark space beneath the floor was a small leather-bound journal. Unlike the official logbooks at my outpost, this one was filled with charcoal drawings. I flipped through the pages. They were chronological. The first few pages showed the valley as it was, beautiful, wild, and green. But as the pages turned, the drawings became darker. The trees began to grow faces. The shadows began to take on solid forms. And then I reached the final page. It was a drawing of my own cabin, Outpost 4. In the drawing, I was sitting at my desk, looking out the window, but standing directly behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders, was the shepherd. He was tall, gaunt, with eyes that were nothing but empty black pits. Suddenly, the kettle on the cold hearth began to whistle. The sound was shrill and piercing, echoing off the stone walls like a scream. I spun around, my axe raised. The water in the kettle was now boiling violently, steam billowing out in thick, suffocating clouds. But there was still no fire. The iron was stone cold. The steam began to thicken, swirling in the center of the room, taking on a humanoid shape. I felt the temperature in the cabin plummet. My breath turned to ice in the air. From within the mist, a hand reached out, a hand made of gray vapor and shadow. "The map is a contract, Elias," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the room. It came from inside my own skull. "Every ranger who finds it becomes part of the mountain's memory. You aren't watching the forest. You are being digested by it." I swung my axe up and missed, but it passed through the vapor as if it were nothing. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into my jacket, and ran for the door. But as I reached the threshold, I stopped dead. The valley outside was gone. In its place was a void of absolute whiteness, a fog that I couldn't see my own hands. I looked back into the cabin. The shepherd was standing by the table now, his black pit eyes fixed on mine. He picked up the piece of bread and took a slow, deliberate bite. "You can't leave the valley until you leave something behind," he said, his voice sounding like grinding stones. I looked at my reflection in a small cracked mirror hanging by the door. My shadow,
The dark silhouette on the floor was gone. It was no longer attached to my feet. It was sitting at the table with the shepherd, its dark hands mimicking my every movement. I didn't wait to hear more. I dove into the white fog, running blindly, guided only by the sheer animal terror screaming in my veins. I climbed the ridges using my bare hands, my fingernails bleeding, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I felt the rough cedar planks of my own porch under my boots. I burst into Outpost 4 and collapsed against the door. I looked down at the floor. The sun was setting, casting long rays of orange light through the window. But where my shadow should have been, there was only empty floor. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. I am still alive. I am still breathing, but I am no longer whole. Part of me is still sitting in that empty cabin in the valley, having tea with a ghost. And the worst part is, I can feel the shepherd's hand still resting on my shoulder, even though there is no one else in the room. I opened the journal that I had stolen. On the last page, the drawing had changed again. The figure of the ranger, me, was now missing its shadow. And beneath the drawing, a new sentence had been written in my own handwriting. The mountain is hungry, and I am the feast.
The eyes in the mist. The sixth day didn't bring the sun. Instead, it brought the gray wall, a fog so dense and stagnant that it felt like the world had been wrapped in wet wool. In the Appalachians, we have a saying, "The mist doesn't hide things, it lets things in." I woke up shivering, despite the embers still glowing in the cast-iron stove. The silvery streaks on my arms from the forbidden trail were pulsing now, a dull, rhythmic glow that matched the thumping of my heart. Every breath I took felt heavy, as if I were inhaling the very essence of the damp earth outside. I checked the oilcloth map. The red ink had bled further, creating a jagged, weeping eye over the area known as the Blind Ridge. It was a place where the mountain leaned over itself, creating deep limestone caverns and jagged overhangs. It was the perfect place for a predator to hide. But out here, in the heart of the Blue Ridge, the predators don't just have claws and teeth. They have patience. I stepped out onto the porch, my boots thudding hollowly on the cedar planks. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of me. The world had been erased. The tall hemlocks were gone. The equipment shed was gone. There was only the white void and the sound of my own breathing. I felt a sudden, sharp prickling on the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. Something was out there, standing just beyond the veil of the fog, watching me with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. I gripped my iron axe, the handle cold and reassuring. "I know you're there," I called out. My voice didn't echo. It was flat, smothered by the mist. There was no answer, just a low, guttural vibration that I felt in my teeth. It wasn't a growl, it was a purr, the sound a cat makes when it's sure of its meal. I stepped down into the tall grass, my flashlight beam cutting a pathetic yellow hole through the white wall. I started walking toward the Blind Ridge. I didn't want to go, but the map was pulling me. It felt like an invisible thread was tied to my chest, reeling me in toward the dark heart of the mountain. As I climbed higher, the fog began to change color. It shifted from a dull gray to a pale, sickly yellow. The smell was the worst part, the scent of wet fur, old copper, and something sweet like rotting lilies. I reached the base of the limestone cliffs, and that's when I saw them. The eyes. They weren't at eye level. They were high up, perched among the jagged rocks. They weren't glowing like an animal's eyes reflecting a light. They were two pale, unblinking discs of white fire. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply hovered in the mist, 30 feet above me. I swung my flashlight upward, but the beam couldn't reach them. It was as if the darkness around the eyes was thick enough to eat the light. "What are you?" I whispered. The eyes vanished, not by closing, but by moving. They drifted sideways with a speed that defied physics, reappearing 10 feet to my left. Then they were to my right, then behind me. I spun in circles, my axe raised, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would crack a rib. I was being circled, not by a beast, but by something that was testing my fear, tasting the adrenaline in the air. I stumbled into the mouth of a shallow cave, seeking shelter from the open ridge. The limestone walls were cold and slick with condensation. I clicked off my flashlight to save the battery and sat in the absolute darkness. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with a wet, rhythmic sound. Slurp, click, slurp. I turned the light back on. The floor of the cave was covered in bones. Not animal bones. They were too long, too straight. These were human remains, hundreds of them, polished white and stacked neatly against the cave walls. And standing in the center of the cave, hunched over a pile of fresh pine branches, was the creature. It was impossibly tall, its limbs thin as saplings and twice as long as a man's. Its skin was the color of a bruised cloud, translucent enough that I could see the dark sludge-like blood pumping through its veins. It had no nose, no ears, only those massive burning white eyes and a mouth that was a jagged vertical slit from its chin to its chest. It looked at me, and for the first time I felt a wave of absolute paralyzing sorrow. It wasn't my sorrow, it was the creature's. It was the mountain's loneliness distilled into a physical form. It tilted its head, and the vertical mouth opened. A sound came out, not a scream, but the sound of my own mother's voice singing the lullaby she used to sing when I was 5 years old. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." I felt my knees buckle. The sound was so perfect, so heartbreakingly familiar, that my brain screamed at me to run, while my heart wanted to step closer. This was how it happened. This was how the people on the map disappeared. They didn't fight. They were lured into the mist by the sounds of the people they missed most. The creature took a step toward me, its long, spindly fingers reaching out. Its touch, I knew, would be like ice. It would take my memories, my voice, and my shadow, and leave me as another polished bone in the pile. I didn't use the axe. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ranger's badge I had found in the Whispering Pines, the one belonging to H. Walker. I threw it at the creature's feet. The metal badge hit the limestone with a sharp clink. The creature froze. It looked down at the badge, and the vertical mouth closed with a wet snap. The white fire in its eyes flickered and dimmed. It let out a sound like a dying animal, a high, mournful whistle. It looked back at me, and for a second the face shifted, the skin tightened, the features blurred, and for a heartbeat I saw the face of Henry Walker staring back at me from the monster's head. "Run," the voice whispered. It wasn't a mimic this time. It was a warning. The creature screamed, a sound that cracked the limestone above us and vanished into the depths of the cave. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted back down the blind ridge, ignoring the rocks tearing at my boots and the branches whipping my face.
I didn't stop until I reached the cabin and slammed the iron bar home. I sat on the floor, gasping for air, the silvery streaks on my arms glowing brighter than ever. I realized then that the eyes in the mist weren't just predators. They were what remains of the people who stayed too long. They were the mountain's failed attempts at keeping its rangers. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. I am still here, but the mist is now pressing against the cracks in the walls. I can hear the lullaby being hummed outside my door, a soft, beautiful melody that makes me want to open the bar and step out into the white void. But I won't. Not tonight. Tonight I will stay in the light of the dying fire, and I will pray that the mist doesn't find a way in, because I know that if I close my eyes, I might wake up with a vertical mouth and a heart made of limestone. The mountain is no longer just watching, it's waiting for me to sing along.
The seventh night felt different. The air in the Appalachians had grown thin and brittle, like old glass ready to shatter. The mist from the blind ridge had finally retreated, but it left a residue on the cabin windows, a thin, oily film that distorted the moonlight into strange, prismatic shapes. I sat at the oak desk, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. The silvery streaks on my skin had faded to a dull gray, but my nerves were raw. Every creak of the cedar planks sounded like a footstep. Every moan of the wind sounded like a name. On the corner of the desk sat my official Forest Service radio. It had been dead since the first night, the battery long since drained, the plastic casing cold and useless. But at exactly 12 a.m., the room changed. The temperature plummeted, and a scent filled the cabin, not the smell of pine or rot, but the sharp ozone tang of an electrical fire. Then the radio hissed. It shouldn't have been possible. The battery was still sitting in my drawer, yet the small red power light on the device began to glow, not a steady light, but a pulsing, heartbeat-like rhythm. The static that poured out of the speaker was thick and textured, a wall of white noise that seemed to vibrate the very air. I reached out to turn the dial, but the knob was stuck, frozen in place by an invisible force. "Mayday! Mayday! Does anyone copy? This is Outpost 4. Do you copy?" The voice was frantic, distorted by a layer of heavy interference, but it wasn't my voice. It was deep, gravelly, and carried a thick Appalachian accent that sounded like it belonged to another century. "Who is this?" I whispered, leaning closer to the speaker. "This is Ranger Miller," the voice crackled. "The date is October 14th, 1981. The ridge has moved. I repeat, the ridge has moved. My compass is spinning, and the sun hasn't come up in 3 days. If anyone can hear me, tell Sarah I'm sorry. I shouldn't have opened the cellar." I froze. October 1981. This broadcast was 45 years old. It was a ghost in the machine, a ripple in time caught in the limestone heart of the mountain. Miller was a name I recognized from the older dusty files, the man who served just before Henry Walker. He was officially listed as retired, but there was no record of where he went or who Sarah was. "Miller, can you hear me?" I asked, knowing it was futile to speak to a recording from the past. The radio went silent for a long moment. Then the static cleared completely, leaving a vacuum of sound so intense it made my ears ache. I reached out to turn the dial, but the knob was stuck, frozen in place by an invisible force. "I can hear you, Elias," the voice said. It was no longer frantic. It was calm, hollow, and impossibly close, as if Miller were standing right behind me, whispering into the microphone of a headset. "I can see you sitting at my desk. You're holding that silver axe. You look just like the others, just like me." I spun around, my axe raised, but the cabin was empty. The door was still barred, the windows were still shut. I was alone, yet the radio continued to pulse with that sickly red light. The mountain doesn't just eat the body, Elias. It eats the when. It folds time like an old map. You think it's 2026. Look at the calendar on the wall. I looked. The modern Forest Service calendar I had pinned up, the one with the high-resolution photos of national parks, had changed. The paper was yellowed and curled. The photos were no longer digital prints, but faded, grainy Polaroids. The year at the top didn't say 2026, it said 1981. Panic flared in my chest. I scrambled toward the door, but as I reached for the iron bar, the radio emitted a high-pitched, piercing squeal that forced me to my knees. The sound was like metal grinding against metal, a frequency that felt like it was peeling the skin off my brain. "Listen to the frequency, Elias," Miller's voice screamed over the noise. "It's the sound of the mountain breathing. It's the sound of the great emptiness coming to reclaim its watchmen." Suddenly, the radio began to broadcast something else. Not a voice, but a series of rhythmic thumps. Thump, thump. It was a heartbeat. My heartbeat. Every time my heart hammered in my chest, the radio amplified the sound until the cabin walls began to shake. The dust on the floorboards danced in time with the rhythm. The glass in the windows began to crack. I realized then that the radio wasn't just receiving a signal, it was broadcasting me. It was broadcasting my fear out into the dark woods, acting as a beacon for whatever was roaming the ridges. I grabbed the radio, intending to smash it against the stone hearth, but as my hands touched the plastic, a jolt of electricity surged through my body. I saw visions, flashes of men in green uniforms, all sitting at the same desk, all staring at the same radio, all screaming into the same silence. I saw Miller, his face gaunt and his eyes wide, as he pulled back a heavy rug in the center of the cabin to reveal a wooden hatch, the cellar he had mentioned. The vision broke, and I fell back onto the floor, the radio slipping from my hands. It hit the wood with a dull thud and went dark. The red light was out. The static was gone. The calendar on the wall was back to its modern, glossy self. I looked at the center of the room. I had been in this cabin for a week, and I had never noticed the rug. It was a heavy, braided thing, covered in decades of dust and grime. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling. I grabbed the edge of the rug and pulled. There, etched into the floorboards, was a square outline, a hatch. "Don't open the cellar," Miller's voice whispered one last time, not from the radio, but from the very wood beneath my fingers. I stared at the hatch. My official blueprints of Outpost 4 didn't include a cellar. There was supposed to be nothing beneath this cabin but solid limestone and the cold earth of the Appalachian Ridge. But I could hear something moving beneath the boards, a soft, wet sliding sound, like a serpent coiling in the dark. I reached for the iron ring of the hatch. My logic told me to run, to get in my truck and never look back. But the mountain had already taken my shadow. It had already started growing in my lungs, and it had already played my voice back to me. There was no a way left to go. The only way out was through the dark. I pulled the ring. The wood groaned, a sound like a dying man's last breath, and the hatch swung open. A blast of freezing ancient air hit my face. It smelled of sulfur and wet stone. I shined my flashlight into the hole. There were no stairs, only a vertical shaft that seemed to go down forever into the black heart of the mountain. And there, pinned to the inside of the hatch door, was a single faded photograph. It was a picture of a man in a 1980s ranger uniform standing on the porch of this cabin. He was smiling, but behind him, visible only in the reflection of the cabin window, was me. Not a ghost, not a double, but me
exactly as I am now, wearing the same torn jacket and holding the same silver axe. The radio in the room behind me let out one final sharp chirp. "Welcome home, Miller," it whispered in my voice. "I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. Or perhaps I am Miller, or perhaps I'm just another frequency caught in the static." I looked down into the black shaft of the cellar, and I realized that the mountain doesn't just keep its rangers, it recycles them. And tonight, it's time for my next shift to begin.
The cellar remained a gaping black maw in the center of the cabin floor, but I couldn't go down. Not yet. Every time I looked into that vertical shaft, my vision blurred, and the silvery streaks on my arms pulsed with a blinding white heat. The mountain was forcing me out again. It didn't want me in the cellar during the day. It wanted me at the summit. I checked the oilcloth map. The red ink had now formed a perfect geometric pattern, a series of interlocking rings near the highest peak of the ridge. The label read, "The Unbroken Chain." The climb toward the summit was brutal. The air had become so thin it felt like breathing through a straw, and the vegetation had changed. The lush greenery was gone, replaced by stunted gray shrubs that looked like coral. The silence was absolute. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of my own footsteps. It was as if I had stepped out of the world of living things and into a cathedral of stone. As I reached the plateau, the mist cleared entirely, revealing a sight that made the blood in my veins go cold. Arranged across the flat gray rock were 7 massive stone circles. These weren't small cairns or simple piles of rocks. These were monoliths, limestone pillars 10 feet tall, carved with the same symbols that had appeared on my cabin door. They were arranged in a fractal pattern, shrinking in size as they moved toward the center of the plateau. I walked toward the largest circle. As I crossed the threshold of the first stone, a low-frequency hum began to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical sensation, like a heavy bass note that rattled my bones. I looked at the center of the circles. Standing there was a small waist-high pedestal of stone, and on top of it sat a single iron-bound box. I felt a magnetic pull toward that box. It was the same pull I felt from the map, from the radio, from the mountain itself. But as I stepped into the second circle, the world around me flickered. For a split second, the gray, barren plateau was gone. I saw a city of glass and light stretching across the valley below, a city that didn't exist in my time. Then it flickered again, and I saw a vast prehistoric sea, the waves crashing against the very spot where I stood. The stone circles weren't just monuments, they were anchors. They held the mountain's timeline together, and I was walking through the intersections of 1,000 different nows. "Don't reach for it, Elias." I spun around. Standing at the edge of the first circle was a man. He wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a monster. He looked like an ordinary hiker, wearing a red flannel shirt and holding a wooden walking stick. But his eyes, they were the color of the limestone, a dull, prehistoric gray. "Who are you?" I demanded, gripping my axe. "I'm the one who came before Miller," the man said. His voice was like grinding gravel. "And the one who came before him. We don't have names here. We only have the weight of the watch." He pointed toward the stone circles. "The mountain isn't a place, Elias. It's an appetite. It found a rift in the earth here, a place where time leaks, and it built itself around it. The stone circles are the teeth. Every time a ranger reaches that box, the mountain takes a bite out of the world. "What's in the box?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man smiled, a sad, hollow expression. "The list, the names of everyone who has ever stood where you were standing, and the names of everyone who ever will. Your name is already on the top of the page, Elias. It was written there before you were even born." I felt a surge of defiance. "I'm not part of your cycle. I'm leaving. I'm going back to the truck, and I'm driving until I hit the ocean." The man laughed, and the sound was echoed by the stone pillars around us. "Look at your hands, Elias. Truly look at them." I looked down. My hands weren't flesh and bone anymore. The silvery streaks had spread, turning my skin into a translucent crystalline substance. I could see the light of the stone circles passing right through my palms. I was becoming part of the geology. I was turning into the very stone I was standing on. The only way to stop the turning is to break the chain, but the mountain won't let you. It needs a witness. It needs someone to remember the silence. I ignored him and pushed forward. I stepped into the third, fourth, and fifth circles. With every step, the hum in my chest grew louder until it was a deafening roar. My vision was a kaleidoscope of eras, forests growing and dying in seconds, the sun streaking across the sky like a frantic spark, the stars shifting into unfamiliar constellations. I reached the center. I stood before the iron-bound box. The hum was so intense now that my nose began to bleed, the blood turning into silver dust before it even hit the ground. I reached out and touched the lid. The iron was cold, colder than the void of space. I flipped the latch. Inside the box was no paper, no list. There was only a single perfectly smooth piece of obsidian, shaped like a human heart, and it was beating. Thump, 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 thump. As I touched the obsidian heart, the mountain let out a roar. The stone pillars around me began to glow with a blinding blue light. I saw the faces of every ranger, Miller, Walker, the man in the red flannel shirt, all of them reflected in the dark surface of the obsidian. And then I saw the face of the mountain itself. It wasn't a god or a spirit. It was a vast, mindless machine of stone and time, and I was the latest cog in its gears. I realized then that the watchman's grave wasn't the cabin. It was the plateau. Every ranger comes here. Every ranger opens the box, and every ranger leaves a piece of their soul in that obsidian heart to keep the mountain alive. I pulled my hand back, but it was too late. The obsidian heart had stopped beating. For a second, the mountain was silent. The glow from the pillars faded. The man in the red flannel shirt vanished into a cloud of dust. Then the beating started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the box. It was coming from me. I looked at my chest. The silvery streaks had formed a glowing lattice over my heart. I was no longer just a ranger. I was the mountain's heartbeat. As long as I lived, the mountain would stay anchored in time. And as long as the mountain stayed anchored, I could never die. I walked back down the ridge, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't need the map anymore. I could feel the entire mountain in my mind, every root, every stone, every hidden cellar. I reached the cabin and looked at the cellar hatch. "Elias!" a voice called from inside the dark hole. It was my own voice, but it sounded young, fresh, and full of a hope I no longer possessed. I realized then that the person I had heard on the radio,
the person I had seen in the mist. It was me, from a different part of the loop. I am the one who warns, and I am the one who ignores the warning. I sat at the desk and opened the logbook. I didn't write about the monsters or the stone circles. I simply wrote, "The watch is constant. The stones are set. Don't let the fire go out. I am Elias, the heart of the Appalachians. The 8th day is over, and the mountain is satisfied. For now."
This is part 9, The Mimic. This episode dives into the uncanny valley of the forest, where the mountain stops being a place and starts becoming a person. Part 9, The Mimic. By the 9th day, the boundary between myself and the ridge had become dangerously thin. I woke up on the floor of the cabin, the wood grain imprinted on my cheek like a brand. When I moved, my joints made a dry, snapping sound, like dead branches breaking underfoot. I walked to the mirror, but I stopped halfway. I didn't want to see what was reflected there. Instead, I looked at the desk. The oilcloth map was no longer red with ink. It had turned a translucent white, as if the paper itself had lost its soul. There were no marks, no paths, no labels. Only a single wet smudge in the center that looked like a thumbprint. The mountain was done guiding me. It was now practicing me. I stepped outside, and the air felt wrong. It was too still. Usually, the Appalachians are a symphony of rustling leaves, shifting soil, and the distant calls of hawks. But today, the forest was a photograph. The birds were visible, perched on the limbs of the hemlocks, but they were silent. Their heads didn't move, their eyes didn't blink. I walked toward the equipment shed, and even the sound of my boots on the gravel felt delayed, like a poorly dubbed movie. Then I heard it. "Elias, where did you put the spare keys?" The voice came from behind the equipment shed. It was my voice, exactly my voice. The same rasp from the mountain air, the same slight hesitation before the word keys. I froze, my hand hovering over the handle of my axe. "Who's there?" I called out. "Who's there?" the voice replied instantly. The tone was perfect, the same rising inflection of fear I had just used. I rounded the corner of the shed, expecting to see a ghost or a monster. Instead, I saw a tree. It was a young birch, its bark white and peeling. But as I watched, the bark began to ripple. The knots in the wood shifted, sliding across the trunk like mercury. 2 knots moved to the top, forming the shape of eyes. A long vertical crack opened beneath them, forming a mouth. "Who's there?" the tree whispered again, but this time its branches shifted, bending into the shape of arms. The leaves at the end of the twigs curled inward, mimicking the shape of human fingers. I backed away, a cold sweat breaking across my chest. This wasn't the faceless man or the creature in the mist. This was the forest itself, trying to assemble a human being out of spare parts. It was learning the geometry of my face, the rhythm of my speech, the way I stood when I was afraid. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, but the forest wouldn't let me go. Every tree I passed began to change. The hemlocks lowered their branches to brush against my shoulders, their needles feeling like coarse hair. The oaks groaned, their heavy trunks twisting until they looked like torsos. "Elias! Elias! Elias!" The name echoed from every direction. It wasn't a call, it was a rehearsal. Thousands of trees were practicing the phonetics of my name, trying to get the L sound just right. The sound grew into a roar, a forest-wide chorus of my own voice, vibrating through the ground and into the soles of my boots. I reached the cabin porch and scrambled inside, but I didn't bar the door. I realized that the wood of the cabin was just as alive as the trees outside. The cedar planks were humming, the heavy oak desk was vibrating. I watched in horror as a knot in the floorboard began to rise, shaping itself into the likeness of a human ear. I am being absorbed, I thought. The mountain is building a version of me that belongs to it. I grabbed the leather-bound journal I had taken from the shepherd's cabin. I needed a way to anchor my mind, to remember what was real. I flipped to the middle of the book, searching for a drawing I hadn't seen. I found one. A sketch of a man standing in a mirror, but his reflection was walking away from him into the woods. Beneath it was a single sentence. The mimic cannot copy what it cannot understand. The weight of a secret. I closed my eyes. I thought of a secret. Something the mountain didn't know. I thought of the way my grandmother's kitchen smelled of burnt sugar in the winter of 1995. I thought of the specific fear I felt when I was 6 years old and got lost in a grocery store for 10 minutes. I focused on the internal, the invisible, the things that aren't written on maps or carved in stone. The humming in the cabin began to fade. The ear on the floorboard recessed back into the wood. The roar of voices outside narrowed down to a single confused whisper. And then, silence. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. The trees were back to being trees. The birds were moving again. I had reclaimed my space, but I knew it was only a temporary victory. The mountain was a fast learner. I walked to the center of the room and looked at the cellar hatch. I realized then why the rangers before me had vanished. They didn't all die. Some of them simply stopped being themselves. They became the trees. They became the fog. They became the very thing they were sent to watch. I knelt by the hatch and whispered into the dark, "I'm still here." From the depths of the mountain, 1,000 voices whispered, perfectly synchronized, perfectly identical to mine. "We know." I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. I am a man of flesh and blood, of memories and secrets. But as I look at my hands, I see that my nail fingers have turned to a hard gray flint. I am a secret that the mountain is slowly uncovering, and I fear that by the time it reaches the core of me, there will be nothing left of Elias to tell the story. The 10th night is coming, the midpoint of the watch, and the mimic is no longer outside. It's in the way I blink. It's in the way I breathe. It's waiting for me to forget who I am so it can finally take my place at the desk. This is part 10, The Cold Front. This episode marks the midpoint of the series, where the atmospheric tension shifts into a claustrophobic, high-stakes survival horror. Part 10, The Cold Front. The 10th day didn't arrive with light. It arrived with a drop in pressure so violent it shattered the glass in my bedside lantern. I woke up to a sound I will never forget, the sound of the mountain screaming. It wasn't a voice this time, it was the wind, a raw, primal force tearing through the high passes of the Appalachians, carrying with it a cold that felt older than the stars. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted from 60 degrees to well below zero in a matter of minutes. My breath didn't just puff into a mist, it crystallized in the air, falling to the floorboards like tiny shards of diamond. I checked the barometer on the wall. The needle hadn't just dropped, it had snapped off the pin. Outside, the world had disappeared behind a wall of white. This wasn't a normal winter storm. This was a dead cold, a supernatural front that the old-timers in the valley whispered about, a storm that doesn't come from the sky, but rises up from the cracks in the limestone. I scrambled to the cast-iron stove, my fingers fumbling with the matches. My hands were stiff, the gray, flint-like skin on my knuckles cracking as I tried to strike a light. The wood was dry, but the fire refused to take. The flames were a sickly, flickering blue, providing no heat, as if the cold itself was an entity that was consuming the chemical energy of the fire. "Not today," I hissed, my teeth chattering so hard I feared they would break. "Not like this." I wrapped myself in every blanket I had, sitting as close to the blue flame stove as I could. Through the howling wind, I began to hear a rhythmic thudding. It was coming from the porch. Thud, thud, thud. It was heavy and slow, the sound of something massive moving with a strange, frozen deliberation. Then the scratching started, but it wasn't on the door. It was coming from the walls, not from the outside, from inside the timber. I watched in frozen horror as the cedar logs of the cabin began to weep. A dark, viscous amber sap began to ooze from the wood, freezing instantly into jagged, needle-like formations. The cabin wasn't protecting me anymore. It was reacting to the cold like a living body in shock. "Elias, it's so cold. Let us in." The voices were back. They weren't whispering from the trees this time. They were coming from the frost on the window panes. The ice crystals were forming into letters, into words, into faces. I saw the face of Miller, his mouth frozen in a silent plea. I saw Walker. I saw the faceless man. They were all there, trapped in the crystalline lattice of the storm, begging for the warmth of the life I still held. Suddenly, the heavy iron bar on the door began to glow with a pale, frost-blue light. The metal was groaning, bending inward as if an invisible giant was leaning its shoulder against the wood. The door didn't break, but the gaps between the logs widened. The wind began to whistle through the cracks, and with the wind came the white shadows. They were wisps of concentrated frost, shapes that moved with a jagged, flickering motion. They drifted across the floor, and wherever they touched, the wood turned to brittle ice. One of them drifted toward my foot. I pulled back, but the hem of my blanket caught the edge of the shadow. Instantly, the fabric shattered like glass. I realized then that the storm wasn't trying to blow the cabin down. It was trying to turn me into a statue, a permanent fixture of the ridge, a frozen monument to the 10th day. I remembered the leather-bound journal. I pulled it from my jacket, my movements slow and agonizing. I flipped to a page near the back, my eyes squinting against the dim blue light. I found a drawing of a heart encased in ice, but at the center of the heart was a single golden spark. The text beneath it read, "The mountain feeds on the cold of the soul. To survive the dead front, you must burn what you value most." I looked around the room. I had nothing left but my gear, my memories, and the journal itself. But then I looked at the oak desk. In the top drawer sat a small wooden music box, the only thing I had brought from home. It had belonged to my mother. It was the only piece of my old life that hadn't been touched by the mountain's gray decay. I hesitated. The music box was my last anchor to the world of sun and soft rain. If I burned it, I was truly becoming a creature of the Appalachians. The blue flame in the stove went out. The white shadows began to converge in the center of the room, forming a towering figure of ice that wore the tattered remnants of a ranger's hat. It reached out for me, its fingers long, jagged icicles.
I didn't wait. I grabbed the music box, smashed it against the stove to break the wood, and shoved the delicate gears and the cedar casing into the hearth. I struck my last match. For a second, nothing happened. Then the music box caught fire. But the flames weren't blue. They were a brilliant, roaring orange. The smell of cedar and old memories filled the cabin, and for the first time in hours, I felt a wave of genuine skin-searing heat. The figure of ice shrieked like a glacier calving into the sea and dissipated into a cloud of steam. The white shadows vanished, the frost on the windows melted, the water running down the glass like tears. The storm outside didn't stop, but the wind changed its tune. It was no longer a scream, it was a mournful howl of defeat. I sat by the stove, watching the orange embers of my past turn to ash. I was warm, but I felt a hollow space opening up inside me. By burning the music box, I had paid the mountain's toll. I had survived the 10th night, but I had sacrificed the last piece of Elias that remembered the world outside the forest. I looked at my hands. The gray flint skin was gone, replaced by a pale, translucent white that looked like marble. I wasn't a tree, and I wasn't a man. I was something else, something that belonged to the storm. I stood up and walked to the cellar hatch. The cold didn't bother me anymore. I felt like I was made of the same ancient limestone as the ridges. I looked down into the black hole and whispered, "The fire is out." A voice drifted up from the darkness, a voice that was no longer a mimic, but a deep, resonant vibration that shook the foundations of the cabin. "Then the watch is half done. Prepare for the stone circles to speak. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. The cold front has passed, but it has left me hollow. I'm halfway through the watch, and I realize tonight that I'm not fighting to stay alive anymore. I'm fighting to remember why being alive mattered in the first place. The 11th day is coming, and with it the scratching at the door will return. But this time, I think I'm ready to answer."
The 11th day broke with a sky so clear it felt artificial, like a blue silk sheet stretched over a graveyard. The dead cold of the previous night had left the mountain brittle. When I stepped onto the porch, the air didn't move. It stood still, frozen in a state of shock. I felt the change in my own body. My skin no longer felt like flint or marble. It felt like nothing at all. I was becoming a ghost in my own skin, a spectator to the slow dissolution of my humanity. I spent the morning cleaning the cabin. It was an obsessive, frantic need to restore order. I swept the ash from the burnt music box into a neat pile. I polished the oak desk until the wood grain looked like swirling galaxies. But no matter how much I cleaned, I couldn't ignore the marks, the scratching. Since the first night, something had been testing the wood of the cabin. It started as a faint, rhythmic sound, like a mouse behind the baseboards, but over the last 10 days, it had evolved. It had become heavy, deliberate, and undeniably intelligent. The scratches weren't random, they were linguistic. They were carved deep into the cedar logs on the outside of the door, forming a sprawling map of symbols that seemed to pulse when I wasn't looking directly at them. I checked the oilcloth map. It was still blank, but as I touched it, a single line of text appeared in the center, written in a handwriting that looked terrifyingly like my own. "It is time to be a host." I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I simply sat in the chair, my silver axe resting across my knees, and watched the door. The sun moved across the sky with agonizing slowness, casting long skeletal shadows across the floorboards. As the orange light of twilight began to bleed into the room, the sound started. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the bottom left corner of the door. It sounded like a long, serrated blade being drawn across a dry bone. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I watched the heavy iron bar that held the door shut. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound moved upward. It was no longer at the bottom of the door. It was at eye level. I could feel the vibration of the wood through the floor. The cabin was humming in sympathy with the intruder. Then the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that makes your ears pop. I waited for a minute, 2 minutes, 5. I slowly rose from the chair, the floorboards silent under my boots, a sign that the mountain was finally letting me move without sound. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against the wood. I expected to hear breathing or the heavy thud of a heart. Instead, I heard a hum, a low-frequency vibration that sounded like 1,000 bees caught in a jar. And then, a voice. It wasn't a mimic. It wasn't my mother or Miller. It was a voice that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. Elias, the door whispered. The bar is an insult. We have already invited ourselves in. I stepped back, raising the axe. Who are you? What do you want from me? We are the collective weight of the ridge. We are the memories of the trees and the hunger of the stones. You have spent 11 days watching us. Now it is our turn to watch you from the inside. Suddenly, the scratches on the door began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. The wood didn't break, it began to soften. The solid cedar logs turned into a substance that looked like wet clay. I watched in frozen horror as a hand began to push through the solid wood. It wasn't a human hand. It was made of twisted roots, braided with human hair, and held together by the same silvery, translucent resin that was now part of my own blood. Then came another hand, then a face that was a terrifying collage of everyone who had ever been lost on the ridge. I saw the jaw of Miller, the brow of Walker, and the eyes. The eyes were mine. The figure didn't step through the door. It uncoiled from it. It stood 7 feet tall, its body a nightmare of forest floor and human remnants. It didn't have feet. Its legs merged directly into the floorboards of the cabin. It was the cabin. It was the mountain. It was the Watcher. The watch is a circle, Elias, the creature said, its many-voiced throat vibrating the air. You think you were sent here to protect the forest from people, but you were sent here to be the vessel. The mountain needs a brain to process its data. It needs a heart to time its pulse. It needs a soul to keep it from drifting into the void. The creature reached out a long root-like finger and touched the silvery lattice on my chest. I felt a jolt of absolute blinding clarity.
I saw the Appalachians not as mountains, but as a giant sleeping organism that spanned half a continent. I saw the rifts in time, the dead zones, and the stone circles as the organs of a beast that breathed once every 100 years. And I saw my place in it. I wasn't the last ranger. I was the current battery. The scratching wasn't to get in, Elias, the creature whispered, its eyes, my eyes, boring into mine. The scratching was to wake you up. You are the door, and tonight the door opens. The creature began to dissolve, its body melting back into the walls and floor of the cabin. But it didn't leave. I could feel it settling into the timber. I could feel it in the desk, in the stove, in the very air I breathed. I was no longer a man in a cabin. I was the man who was the cabin. I looked at my hands. They were gone. Not invisible, but merged with the air. I looked down at the floor. I could see the roots of the trees beneath the earth. I could hear the worms turning in the soil 5 miles away. I could hear the heartbeat of a hiker lost on the forbidden trail 3 days in the future. The scratching started again, but this time it wasn't on the door. It was on the inside of my ribs. I am Elias, the last ranger of the Appalachians. I finally know what has been scratching at the door for 11 days. It was me, the version of me that the mountain has been building since the moment I signed the contract. And tonight, that version is finally finished. I walked to the desk, though I no longer felt the floor. I picked up the pen, though I no longer felt the weight. I wrote a single sentence in the logbook. The guest has arrived, and he is wearing my skin. I looked at the cellar hatch. It was open. It had been open the whole time. I realized then that I didn't need to go down the shaft to find the truth. I was the shaft. I was the dark. I was the Appalachian night. The 12th day is coming, and I can hear the ranger's journal calling to me from the valley. It's time to read the pages I haven't written yet.
The 12th day didn't start with a sunrise. It started with the sound of turning pages. I was sitting at the oak desk, though I no longer felt the chair beneath me. My body felt like a collection of echoes, a ghost limb sensation that extended from the cabin walls to the very roots of the mountain. On the desk lay the leather-bound journal I had taken from the shepherd's cabin, the one that had previously been filled with cryptic sketches and warnings. But today, the journal was different. The pages were no longer made of paper. They were thin sheets of dried bark, and the ink wasn't ink. It was a dark, dried substance that smelled of iron and ancient soil. The handwriting shifted on every page, representing a dozen different men from a dozen different decades. I reached out to touch the book. As my fingers, now translucent and pale as quartz, brushed the first page, the room around me dissolved. I wasn't in Outpost 4 anymore. I was standing in a field of tall, golden grass under a sky that burned with 2 suns. This was the Appalachians, but not as I knew them. This was the mountain's memory of itself from 1,000,000 years ago. Day 4380, a voice read aloud, vibrating through the air. It was a tired voice, thick with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. I am no longer Ranger Thomas. I am the ridge. My heart beats once for every 1,000 trees that die. They told me I could retire when the successor arrived, but they didn't tell me I had to become the successor's shadow. I turned the page. The golden field vanished, replaced by a dark, cramped space. I was inside a tree. I could feel the sap running through my veins, the slow, agonizing stretch of my limbs as I grew toward a light I would never reach. Day 15,200, another voice whispered. This one higher, more frantic. It was the voice of Miller. Sarah came to the cabin today, or at least the mountain's version of her did. She looked perfect, except for the way her eyes didn't reflect the light. I followed her into the cellar. I thought I was going home, but the cellar is just a throat. It doesn't lead back to the valley. It leads into the marrow. I felt a cold shiver run through my translucent chest. The journal wasn't just a diary, it was a record of the processing. The Forest Service didn't hire rangers to protect the land, they hired them as biological anchors. The mountain, in its vast, mindless antiquity, needs human consciousness to keep its reality stable. Without a ranger's mind to observe it, the mountain would drift into a chaotic realm of shifting time and impossible geometry. I turned to the final pages, the ones that had been blank. Now they were filled with a familiar script, my own. The 12th day, Elias. He has realized that he is the battery. He has felt the scratching inside his ribs. He thinks he is fighting the mimic, but he is actually becoming the template. Tonight, the retirement ceremony begins. I dropped the journal, the bark pages clattering like dead leaves. "No," I whispered. "I'm not part of this. I'm going to leave." But as I stood up, I looked at the desk. There was a photograph sitting there that hadn't been there a second ago. It was a modern digital photo, the kind you'd take with a smartphone. It showed a young man standing in a Forest Service office, holding a signed contract. It was me, but in the background of the photo, standing behind the glass of the office window, was a tall, gaunt figure in a tattered 1970s uniform. I realized with a jolt of horror that Henry Walker hadn't been a ghost haunting me. He had been my watchman. He had been the one anchored to the ridge, waiting for me to arrive so he could finally retire into the trees. And now it was my turn. A heavy thud sounded from the porch, then another. The successor was here. I looked through the window. A truck was pulling into the clearing, a modern white truck with the Forest Service logo on the door. A young man stepped out, his eyes scanning the horizon with a mix of awe and anxiety. He looked exactly like I did 12 days ago. He walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the gravel. I wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to get back in the truck and never look back. But when I opened my mouth, no sound came out, only the low, rhythmic hum of the mountain. My voice was no longer my own. The young man stepped onto the porch and knocked on the door. "Hello? Is anyone here? I'm the new ranger for Outpost 4. My name is Caleb." I looked down at the journal. A new page was forming. The 13th day, Caleb. I realized then what retirement meant. To retire was to lose your physical form and become the atmosphere of the ridge. You become the wind that whispers the names. You become the fog that hides the predators. You become the quiet in the quiet cabin. I watched as Caleb reached for the door handle. I was standing right in front of him, but he didn't see me. He walked right through me, a sensation like a cold breeze passing through a cloud of smoke. He looked around the cabin, his eyes settling on the oak desk, the iron stove, and the heavy leather-bound journal. "Cozy," he whispered to himself. I stood in the corner, my quartz-like skin shimmering in the twilight.
I saw the silvery lattice on his chest beginning to form, though he didn't know it yet. I saw the scratching on the door that he would discover tomorrow morning. I am Elias, the former ranger of the Appalachians. My watch is over, and my retirement has begun. I am the shadow in the window. I am the hum in the radio. I am the reason the trees whisper his name. Caleb sat at the desk and opened the journal. He saw my final entry. The watch is constant. The stones are set. Don't let the fire go out. He frowned, his finger tracing the letters I had written. Then he looked up directly at the corner where I was standing. For a split second our eyes met. He didn't see a man. He saw a glitch in the air, a ripple in the reality of the room. He shivered and turned back to the journal. "Must be the draft," he muttered to himself. I leaned down and whispered into his ear. A sound to him would only be the moan of the wind against the cedar logs. "Welcome to the ridge, Caleb. We've been waiting for your heart. The 13th day has begun, and for the first time in a century, the mountain is truly, terrifyingly hungry." The transition was not like falling asleep. It was like shattering and finding that every shard of your being was still conscious. I stood in the corner of Outpost 4, watching Caleb. To him, I was nothing more than a trick of the light, a smudge of cold air in an otherwise warm room. But to me, the world had become a translucent overlay of 1,000 different eras. I could see the cabin as it was built in the 1930s, the wood still dripping with fresh resin. I could see it rotting into the earth 100 years in the future, and I could see it now, occupied by a boy who had no idea he had just walked into his own funeral. "Why is it so quiet?" Caleb whispered to himself. He was fiddling with the dial of the radio, the same radio that had screamed Miller's ghost into my ears just nights ago. To Caleb, it was just a piece of dead plastic. He hadn't realized yet that the mountain chooses when to speak. I tried to reach out, to knock a cup off the desk, to give him a sign to run. But my hand passed through the oak wood like smoke through a screen door. I was no longer a participant in the physical world. I was a witness, and being a witness was the true torture of the ridge. A low subterranean rumble vibrated through the floorboards. Caleb didn't hear it, but I felt it in my very soul. It was the mountain's stomach growling. It was hungry again, and it wasn't satisfied with just my shadow. It wanted Caleb's youth, his memories of the city, his plans for a future that would never happen. "I need some air," Caleb muttered, his face pale. He was already feeling the clutch, that first stage of isolation where the oxygen starts to feel like lead. He stepped out onto the porch, and I followed him, drifting through the solid cedar logs. The night was absolute. The Appalachians under the moon looked like a jagged jawbone waiting to snap shut. Caleb looked out toward the ridge, and for a second he froze. High above us, on the peak of the blind ridge, a shadow was moving. It wasn't a small shadow. It was immense, a towering silhouette that blotted out the stars. It moved with a slow, agonizing grace, its limbs stretching and bending in ways that defied human anatomy. It was the shadow over the ridge, the manifestation of the mountain's ancient collective ego. Caleb squinted, rubbing his eyes. "Is that a cloud?"
I wanted to scream. "No, Caleb, that is the thing that will eventually wear your skin." The shadow began to descend. It didn't walk down the slopes, it flowed down them like spilled ink. As it moved, the trees it touched didn't just bend, they withered. The pines turned to ash in its wake, and the stones cracked under its ethereal weight. I realized then that my role as the shadow wasn't just to watch. I was part of the defense mechanism. I was supposed to lure Caleb back inside, to keep the battery safe until the mountain was ready to drain him. The shadow reached the edge of the clearing. It had no face, only a hollow void where a heart should be, and eyes that burned with a cold blue fire, the same fire I had seen in the stove during the cold front. Caleb finally sensed the danger. His primitive survival instincts, though dull from city life, began to scream. He backed toward the door, his hand fumbling for the handle. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice cracking. The shadow stopped 10 feet from the porch, and it began to shift, its form bubbling and reforming until it took a shape Caleb would recognize. It didn't become a monster. It became a girl with golden hair and a summer dress, looking out of place in the dark, frozen woods. "Caleb?" the shadow whispered, using a voice that sounded like honey and sunlight. "Caleb, I'm lost. Please help me." I saw Caleb's expression change. The fear was still there, but it was being overwritten by a desperate, misplaced hope. He took a step off the porch. "Sarah? Is that you? How did you get here?" The shadow smiled, a jagged, terrifying expression that Caleb couldn't see in the dark. It reached out a hand made of mist and malice. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I gathered every ounce of my fading willpower, every memory of the man I used to be, the Elias who liked black coffee and old jazz and the smell of rain. I pushed myself into the physical layer of reality. It felt like walking through a wall of needles. I appeared between Caleb and the shadow. For a split second, I was solid. I was the gaunt, quartz-skinned ranger with the silver axe. "Run!" I roared. The sound wasn't a voice, it was a thunderclap. The porch shook, the windows of the cabin shattered. Caleb was knocked backward by the sheer force of the sound. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror deeper than anything he had felt before. He didn't see a savior. He saw the monster I had become. He scrambled back into the cabin and slammed the door, throwing the iron bar into place. The shadow turned its blue fire eyes on me. The girl mask melted away, revealing the void once more. It let out a high-pitched hiss that sounded like steam escaping a pressurized pipe. "You interfere, Elias. The cycle requires the harvest. You are but a shadow. Why do you cling to the dust of your humanity?" Because it's the only thing you can't have," I whispered as my form flickered as the effort drained me. The shadow drifted back into the woods, retreating toward the high peaks. It could wait. Time meant nothing to the mountain. Caleb was trapped now. He had seen the ghost of Outpost 4, and the isolation would do the rest of the work. I sat on the edge of the porch, watching the moon sink behind the jagged teeth of the Appalachians. I looked at my hands. They were almost completely gone now, just a faint shimmer in the night air.
Inside the cabin, I could hear Caleb sobbing. He was huddled in the corner, clutching the ranger's journal, his mind already starting to fracture. I realized then the cruelest part of my retirement. To save him, I had to terrify him. To keep him alive, I had to be his nightmare. I am Elias, the shadow over the ridge. I am the protector of the person who fears me most. And as the 14th day approaches, I can see the ghost light rising from the marsh in the valley. The mountain is calling for a different kind of tribute tonight. And this time, I won't be able to stand in the way.
The ghost light. The 14th day began with a suffocating humidity that shouldn't have existed at this altitude. The air was thick, smelling of stagnant water and ancient, rotting vegetation. Inside the cabin, Caleb was a wreck. He hadn't slept, his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept staring at the corner where I had appeared the night before. He was holding my old silver axe, his knuckles white, waiting for a ghost that he couldn't see. I stood by the window, my form nothing more than a ripple in the humid air. I could feel the mountain shifting its tactics. The dead cold and the shadow had failed because they were too direct, too terrifying. Tonight, the ridge would use a softer, more seductive touch. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange neon blue glow began to rise from the valley floor. It wasn't the moon, and it wasn't a forest fire. It was the ghost light, the ignis fatuus of the Appalachians. Caleb noticed it almost immediately. He stood up, drawn to the window as if pulled by a magnetic force. The blue light was beautiful, flickering like a candle in the distance, dancing between the trunks of the skeletal hemlocks. To a man lost in the dark, it looked like a campfire. It looked like help. "Someone's out there," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate hope. "There's a search party. They've come for me." I tried to reach for him, to cold press my spectral hand against his forehead to snap him out of the trance, but the humidity made me weak. I felt like I was dissolving into the dampness. Caleb grabbed his jacket and his flashlight. He didn't even remember to bar the door behind him. He stepped out into the night, his eyes fixed on that bobbing, ethereal blue flame. "Hey, over here!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the damp valley. The ghost light didn't move toward him. It retreated. It skipped over a fallen log and drifted deeper into the woods, toward the Blackwood Marsh, a place where the earth is neither solid nor liquid, but a hungry black slurry of bones and peat. I followed him, drifting through the branches, my heart, if I still had one, sinking with every step he took. The deeper we went, the more the forest changed. The pines gave way to gnarled, twisted cypress trees that looked like petrified giants. The ground became soft, sucking at Caleb's boots with a wet, rhythmic squelch. "Wait! Please don't leave!" Caleb cried out, picking up his pace. He was running now, tripping over roots and thorns, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. The ghost light stopped in the middle of a clearing. It hovered 3 feet above a pool of perfectly black water. Around the pool, the skeletons of trees stood like silent sentinels. As Caleb approached, the light began to hum, a high-pitched melodic vibration that sounded like a choir of children singing a wordless hymn. Is someone there?"
Caleb asked, reaching the edge of the dark pool. The blue light expanded, its glow illuminating the surface of the water. Beneath the ripples, I saw them. Faces, dozens of them, preserved by the peat and the cold. They were the sleepers, the ones who had followed the light in decades past. Their eyes were open, staring up through the water with a look of peaceful, terrifying vacancy. One of the faces began to move. It drifted to the surface, its skin looking like tanned leather. It was Sarah, the girl the shadow mimicked. But this wasn't a shadow. This was the memory of the marsh itself. "Caleb, it's so quiet down here. No more scratching, no more mountain. Just the blue light. Just rest." Caleb dropped his flashlight. He kneeled at the edge of the dark pool, his hand reaching towards the water. The blue light hovered just inches from his fingertips. I could see the blue fire reflecting in his pupils, erasing his will, turning his fear into a hollow, welcoming void. I knew I couldn't roar this time. The marsh would swallow the sound. I had to do something the mountain didn't expect. I had to give up a piece of my remaining essence to create a distraction. I focused on the silvery lattice that still shimmered where my heart used to be. I tore a piece of it away. The pain was astronomical. It felt like my soul was being shredded by 1,000 rusted hooks. I threw that piece of Elias toward the ghost light. The fragment of my spirit hit the blue flame. Instantly, the blue light turned a violent, screaming red. The choir of children's voices became a distorted electronic shriek. The peaceful faces in the pool twisted into masks of agony. The shock broke Caleb's trance. He lurched backward away from the water, his boots slipping in the mud. He saw the leathery Sarah for what she was, a rotting corpse held together by peat and malice. "God, no!" Caleb screamed, scrambling to his feet. The marsh didn't like being denied its meal. The black water began to churn, and long skeletal arms made of mud and matted hair reached for Caleb's ankles. "Run, Caleb! Don't look back!" I screamed, the effort of the shout causing my spectral form to flicker and tear. Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted back through the cypress trees, his breath coming in jagged, panicked gasps. He didn't have his flashlight, but the red glare of my dying spirit fragment lit the way back to the ridge. He reached the cabin and dove inside, slamming the door and sliding the iron bar home with a force that shook the entire structure. He collapsed against the wood, sobbing, his hands covered in the black, oily muck of the marsh. I drifted back to the porch, feeling thinner than I ever had. I was fading. The act of tearing my spirit had cost me dearly. I looked at my hands. They were almost entirely transparent now, just a suggestion of a shape in the moonlight. The ghost light returned to the valley floor, turning blue once more. It bobbed peacefully, waiting for the next time Caleb would feel lonely. Inside the cabin, Caleb crawled toward the stove. He didn't try to light it. He just sat in the dark, clutching the silver axe. He looked at the door, then at the window, finally at the cellar hatch. "I can't stay here," he whispered, his voice broken. He was right. The 14th day had proven that the mountain owned the roads, the woods, and even the light. Caleb was no longer a ranger. He was a prisoner waiting for his sentence. I am Elias, the dying flicker of Outpost 4. I saved him tonight, but I am running out of pieces to give. The 15th day is coming, and I can feel the hidden cellar pulsing below the floorboards. The mountain is done playing games in the woods. It's time to go into the dark.
The hidden cellar. The 15th day didn't bring any light. The sun was technically up, but a strange, bruised purple gloom had settled over Outpost 4, as if the sky itself was losing its ability to project color. Inside the cabin, Caleb was unrecognizable. He had used the soot from the stove to draw symbols on the walls, crude, desperate copies of the marks I had once seen on the door. He was trying to build a fortress of his own mind, but the mountain was already under his fingernails. I felt myself flickering. The act of saving him from the ghost light had left me like a dying ember. I was no longer a solid ghost. I was a vibration, a memory of a man named Elias. I sat, or rather, I drifted, near the desk, watching the center of the room. The rug that covered the cellar hatch was vibrating. Not a violent shake, but a soft, rhythmic pulse, like the breathing of a sleeping giant. Mealer noticed it too. He stood in the corner, the silver axe trembling in his hands. He hadn't touched the hatch since he arrived, but today the choice was being taken away from him. The wood of the floorboards began to groan, the iron ring of the hatch rattling against the timber. "What do you want?" Caleb screamed at the floor. "Just take me! End it!" The floor didn't answer with words. Instead, a thick black fluid, the same oily sludge from the black wood marsh, began to seep upward through the cracks in the hatch. It didn't spread, it pooled, forming a perfect dark circle in the middle of the room. I tried to warn him. I tried to manifest enough strength to push the heavy oak desk over the hatch, but I was too weak. I could only watch as the invisible gravity of the mountain took hold. Caleb's feet began to slide toward the dark pool. He fought it, digging his heels into the wood, but it was like trying to resist the pull of a black hole. "No! No! Please!" With a sound like a wet lung collapsing, the hatch flew open. It didn't lead to a crawl space or a storage room. I looked down through the hole, and my spectral mind buckled. It was an impossible shaft, lined with the same glowing limestone as the stone circles. The walls were covered with thousands of clocks, grandfather clocks, wristwatches, sundials, all of them ticking at different speeds, creating a deafening mechanical roar. Caleb was pulled over the edge. He screamed as he vanished into the dark, his flashlight falling with him, its beam spinning like a dying star. I didn't hesitate. I threw my fading essence into the shaft after him. The descent was a journey through the mountain's digestive system. We weren't just falling through space, we were falling through time. I saw Caleb pass through layers of the shaft where the walls were made of frozen lightning. I saw layers where the air was filled with the floating, translucent ghosts of every animal that had ever died on the ridge. Finally, we hit the bottom. We were in a vast cathedral-like cavern deep beneath the crust of the earth. The ceiling was so high it was hidden in a mist of glowing spores. In the center of the cavern stood the engine, a massive rotating sphere of obsidian and iron, suspended in mid-air by pillars of solid light. This was the heart of the Appalachians. This was the machine that processed human souls into the reality of the ridge. Caleb lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for air. He looked up at the engine, and the reflection in its dark surface shattered what was left of his sanity. He saw his own life, not just his past, but every possible version of his future, being shredded into thin, glowing ribbons and fed into the rotating sphere. "Is this hell?" he whispered. "No," I said, my voice finally finding a way to resonate in this deep, hollow place. I appeared beside him, my form glowing with a faint, dying blue light. "The 15th day is the day of the gear. The boy is fresh, his memories are vivid. The engine will run for 100 years on a soul like this." Mila reached out an iron hand toward Caleb. "Come, Caleb, it's time to stop being a man and start being a when." Caleb scrambled backward, but the floor was turning to liquid stone. He was sinking. I looked at the engine, then at Caleb, and finally at the small, glowing lattice that remained of my own heart. I realized then that my retirement hadn't been about fading away. It had been about preparation. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't stop the mountain, but I could jam the gears. "Caleb, listen to me," I said, kneeling beside him. "When I touch the engine, the mountain will freeze for a split second. The shaft will become a staircase. You run. You don't look at the clocks. You don't listen to the voices. You run until you see the stars." "What about you, Elias?" Caleb asked, tears carving tracks through the grime on his face. "I'm already home," I said with a smile I hadn't felt in years. I stood up and walked toward the engine. The gravity was immense, trying to pull the very atoms of my spirit apart. Miller tried to stop me, but I passed through his iron body like a needle through silk. I reached the rotating sphere of obsidian and shoved my entire being, every memory of the city, every drop of my mother's perfume, every secret I had ever kept, directly into the center of the machine. The engine screamed. The gears ground to a halt with a sound that must have been felt as an earthquake from Georgia to Maine. The glowing pillars of light flickered and died. The ticking of the millions of clocks stopped at once, creating a silence so absolute it felt like death. "Go!" I roared, my voice now a part of the mountain's own thunder. Caleb didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the liquid stone and began to climb the shaft. I could feel him moving upward, his heartbeat a frantic drum in the silent cavern. I watched him go until he was nothing but a speck of light in the distance. I turned back to the engine. I was no longer Elias. I was a crack in the mountain's logic. I was the grit in the gear. Miller stood before me, his clock eyes stopped at 12 o'clock. He looked at me, and for the first time, the iron on his face softened into human grief. "You've only delayed it, Elias," he whispered. "The mountain will restart. It always restarts." "Then I'll be here to stop it again," I replied. "I am Elias, the ghost in the machine of the Appalachians. The 16th day is coming, and upstairs a new guest is arriving at the cabin." Caleb made it out, but the ridge is already calling for a replacement. And as the engine begins to hum once more, I realize that my watch hasn't ended. It has just moved to a place where time doesn't exist. The uninvited guest. The 16th day did not begin with the mechanical roar of the engine, but with a terrifying, hollow silence. I was no longer a man, nor was I a simple ghost. I was a stain on the consciousness of the mountain. By jamming the gears of the engine, I had carved out a pocket of no time for myself. I was back in the cabin, but the cabin was different. The walls were translucent, shimmering like the surface of a bubble, and the air was thick with the static of 1,000 interrupted radio signals. Caleb was gone. I could feel his presence miles away, a fading spark of warmth as he fled toward the civilization that would never truly believe his story. But the mountain does not tolerate a vacuum. The vacancy at Outpost 4 had been noticed. As a violent, unnatural thunderstorm rolled over the ridge, lightning striking the ground in rhythmic, mathematical patterns, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a new ranger. It was a heavy, desperate pounding. Through the shimmering wood of the door, I saw her. She wasn't wearing green or holding a clipboard. She was wearing a rain-soaked hiking jacket, her face pale and streaked with mud. She looked like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn on the Appalachian Trail. But I knew better. No one finds Outpost 4 by accident. The mountain draws you here. "Help! Please! Is anyone there?" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the thunder. I stood by the desk, my form flickering between the quartz white of a guardian and the gray ash of a victim. I tried to speak, but the air in the cabin was dead. I had no lungs to push the sound, no throat to shape the warning. The door, sensing a fresh soul, did not wait for an invitation. The iron bar, the one I had relied on for so long, simply slid aside as if the metal had turned to water. The door swung open, and the woman stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floorboards. "Thank God," she gasped, her chest heaving. She didn't see me. To her, the cabin was empty, illuminated only by the dying blue embers in the stove. She stood up and began to strip off her wet jacket. Her name, according to the tag on her backpack, was Maya. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with the kind of bright, curious eyes that the mountain loves to extinguish. As she moved toward the desk to find a light, she stepped directly over the cellar hatch. The hatch didn't pulse, it didn't groan, it lay perfectly still, waiting for her to feel safe. That was the mountain's new tactic: silence. It knew I was watching, and it was playing a game of cat and mouse with my spectral conscience. Maya found a box of matches on the desk. She struck one, and the small orange flame cut through the gloom. For a split second, the light hit me. Our eyes met. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she simply froze, the match burning down toward her fingers. "Who are you?" she whispered. I realized that because I had jammed the engine, the laws of reality in the cabin were broken. She could see me, not as a monster, but as a man, the tired, transparent remains of Elias. "You have to leave," I said, my voice sounding like the rustling of dry leaves, but she heard me. "The storm is a lure. The cabin is a throat. Get out now while the mountain is still digesting the last one." "I can't," she said, her chest trembling. "There's something out there, in the trees. It has my brother's face. It's been following me since the Blackwood Marsh." My heart, the memory of it, constricted. The mimic, it was already here, herding her toward the center of the ridge. The mountain wasn't just waiting for her to stumble, it was hunting her with the faces of her loved ones. "Listen to me, Maya," I said, stepping closer, my form rippling like a reflection in a disturbed pond. "The thing outside isn't your brother, and the floor beneath your feet isn't solid. If you stay here, you become part of the record. You become a page in a journal no one will ever read." Suddenly,
The cabin walls began to groan. The uninvited guest was no longer just Maya. The shadow over the ridge had arrived, its massive, dark silhouette blotting out the lightning flashes in the window. The cabin lights, long dead, suddenly flickered to life, glowing with a harsh violet radiance. The floorboards began to liquefy. The black sludge I had seen before started to ooze from the corners of the room. "Stay behind me," I roared, and for the first time since my retirement, I felt a surge of the mountain's own power. I grabbed the silver axe from the desk. It wasn't a physical object anymore. It was a weapon of pure intent, glowing with the white fire of every ranger who had ever died with their boots on. I swung the axe at the floor, and the white light cut through the black sludge like a hot blade through wax. The mountain shrieked. The sound was a combination of 1,000 radio frequencies and the grinding of tectonic plates. "Elias!" she screamed, clutching my translucent arm. Her touch felt like a jolt of electricity, anchoring me back to the world of the living. "The door! It's gone!" She was right. Where the door had been, there was now only a wall of solid, unyielding limestone. The cabin was sealing itself shut. We weren't in a house anymore. We were inside a tomb. I looked at Maya, then at the cellar hatch. I realized that the only way to save her was to take her deeper into the dark. If the mountain wanted a sacrifice, I would have to give it something it didn't expect. A ghost who refused to haunt and a human who refused to fear. "We can't go out," I said, my quartz skin shining bright enough to illuminate the entire cabin. "We have to go down, to the engine. If I can hold it still for long enough, I can find a rift in the time stream. I can send you back to the valley, to the day before you ever stepped onto this ridge." "But what about you?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror and wonder. "I'm the watchman, Maya. I don't leave. I just wait for the next shift." I grabbed her hand, and together we dove into the open hatch. The descent was different this time. We weren't being digested. We were invading. As we fell through the shaft of clocks and frozen lightning, the mountain's defenses lashed out. Phantoms of previous rangers, Miller, Walker, and a dozen others, clawed at us, their iron fingers reaching for Maya's warmth. But I was the grit in the gear. I swung the spectral axe, clearing a path through the memories of the ridge. We hit the bottom of the cavern. The engine was spinning again, but it was erratic, vibrating with a violent, screeching energy. Miller was there, his clock eyes spinning so fast that they were a blur of red light. "You brought a guest to the heart, Elias," the mountain boomed. "The mountain thanks you. It has been hungry for a woman's song." "She's not for you, Miller," I said, standing between Maya and the engine, "and neither am I." I looked at Maya. "When I hit the center of the engine, don't look back. Just run toward the blue light in the rift. It will take you to the trailhead. You'll wake up in your car, and this will all be a bad dream." "I'll remember you," she whispered. "No," I said, my form beginning to dissolve into pure white light. "If I do this right, no one will ever remember me again, and that's exactly how it should be." I turned and sprinted toward the engine. I didn't just shove my memories into it this time. I shoved my entire existence. I became a supernova of human will in the center of the mountain's mindless logic. The engine didn't just stop, it imploded. The 16th day ended with a flash of light that could be seen for 50 miles. In the valley below, hikers looked up at the ridge and saw a pillar of white fire rising into the sky, then vanishing as if it had never been. Maya woke up in her SUV at the trailhead. The sun was shining. Her brother was in the passenger seat, complaining about the GPS. She felt a strange cold ache in her hand, but when she looked, there was nothing there, just a faint silvery smudge that vanished in the sunlight. Deep beneath Outpost 4, the cavern was silent. The engine was a pile of cold obsidian shards. Miller was gone, but in the center of the ruins, a single quartz-white figure remained. I am Elias, the man who broke the Appalachians. I am no longer a ranger, a ghost, or a shadow. I am the silence that follows the storm. But as the 17th day approaches, I can feel the stones above me beginning to pull themselves together. The mountain is rebuilding, it is learning, it is evolving, and it is very, very angry.
The uninvited guest. The 16th day did not begin with the mechanical roar of the engine, but with a terrifying, hollow silence. I was no longer a man, nor was I a simple ghost. I was a stain on the consciousness of the mountain. By jamming the gears of the engine, I had carved out a pocket of no time for myself. I was back in the cabin, but the cabin was different. The walls were translucent, shimmering like the surface of a bubble, and the air was thick with the static of 1,000 interrupted radio signals. Caleb was gone. I could feel his presence miles away, a fading spark of warmth as he fled toward the civilization that would never truly believe his story. But the mountain does not tolerate a vacuum. The vacancy at Outpost 4 had been noticed. As a violent, unnatural thunderstorm rolled over the ridge, lightning striking the ground in rhythmic, mathematical patterns, a knock came at the door. It wasn't the tentative knock of a new ranger. It was a heavy, desperate pounding. Through the shimmering wood of the door, I saw her. She wasn't wearing green or holding a clipboard. She was wearing a rain-soaked hiking jacket, her face pale and streaked with mud. She looked like a tourist who had taken a wrong turn on the Appalachian Trail. But I knew better. No one finds Outpost 4 by accident. The mountain draws you here. "Help! Please! Is anyone there?" she screamed, her voice barely audible over the thunder. I stood by the desk, my form flickering between the quartz white of a guardian and the gray ash of a victim. I tried to speak, but the air in the cabin was dead. I had no lungs to push the sound, no throat to shape the warning. The door, sensing a fresh soul, did not wait for an invitation. The iron bar, the one I had relied on for so long, simply slid aside as if the metal had turned to water. The door swung open, and the woman stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floorboards. "Thank God," she gasped, her chest heaving. She didn't see me. To her, the cabin was empty, illuminated only by the dying blue embers in the stove. She stood up and began to strip off her wet jacket. Her name, according to the tag on her backpack, was Maya. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with the kind of bright, curious eyes that the mountain loves to extinguish. As she moved toward the desk to find a light, she stepped directly over the cellar hatch. The hatch didn't pulse, it didn't groan, it lay perfectly still, waiting for her to feel safe. That was the mountain's new tactic: silence. It knew I was watching, and it was playing a game of cat and mouse with my spectral conscience. Maya found a box of matches on the desk. She struck one, and the small orange flame cut through the gloom. For a split second, the light hit me. Our eyes met. She didn't scream, she didn't run, she simply froze, the match burning down toward her fingers. "Who are you?" she whispered.
I realized that because I had jammed the engine, the laws of reality in the cabin were broken. She could see me, not as a monster, but as a man, the tired, transparent remains of Elias. "You have to leave," I said, my voice sounding like the rustling of dry leaves, but she heard me. "The storm is a lure. The cabin is a throat. Get out now while the mountain is still digesting the last one." "I can't," she said, her chest trembling. "There's something out there, in the trees. It has my brother's face. It's been following me since the Blackwood Marsh." My heart, the memory of it, constricted. The mimic, it was already here, herding her toward the center of the ridge. The mountain wasn't just waiting for her to stumble, it was hunting her with the faces of her loved ones. "Listen to me, Maya," I said, stepping closer, my form rippling like a reflection in a disturbed pond. "The thing outside isn't your brother, and the floor beneath your feet isn't solid. If you stay here, you become part of the record. You become a page in a journal no one will ever read." Suddenly, the cabin walls began to groan. The uninvited guest was no longer just Maya. The shadow over the ridge had arrived, its massive, dark silhouette blotting out the lightning flashes in the window. The cabin lights, long dead, suddenly flickered to life, glowing with a harsh violet radiance. The floorboards began to liquefy. The black sludge I had seen before started to ooze from the corners of the room. "Stay behind me," I roared, and for the first time since my retirement, I felt a surge of the mountain's own power. I grabbed the silver axe from the desk. It wasn't a physical object anymore. It was a weapon of pure intent, glowing with the white fire of every ranger who had ever died with their boots on. I swung the axe at the floor, and the white light cut through the black sludge like a hot blade through wax. The mountain shrieked. The sound was a combination of 1,000 radio frequencies and the grinding of tectonic plates. "Elias!" she screamed, clutching my translucent arm. Her touch felt like a jolt of electricity, anchoring me back to the world of the living. "The door! It's gone!" She was right. Where the door had been, there was now only a wall of solid, unyielding limestone. The cabin was sealing itself shut. We weren't in a house anymore. We were inside a tomb. I looked at Maya, then at the cellar hatch. I realized that the only way to save her was to take her deeper into the dark. If the mountain wanted a sacrifice, I would have to give it something it didn't expect, a ghost who refused to haunt and a human who refused to fear. "We can't go out," I said, my quartz skin shining bright enough to illuminate the entire cabin. "We have to go down, to the engine. If I can hold it still for long enough, I can find a rift in the time stream. I can send you back to the valley, to the day before you ever stepped onto this ridge." "But what about you?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror and wonder. "I'm the watchman, Maya. I don't leave. I just wait for the next shift." I grabbed her hand, and together we dove into the open hatch. The descent was different this time. We weren't being digested. We were invading. As we fell through the shaft of clocks and frozen lightning, the mountain's defenses lashed out. Phantoms of previous rangers, Miller, Walker, and a dozen others, clawed at us, their iron fingers reaching for Maya's warmth. But I was the grit in the gear. I swung the spectral axe, clearing a path through the memories of the ridge. We hit the bottom of the cavern. The engine was spinning again, but it was erratic, vibrating with a violent, screeching energy. Miller was there, his clock eyes spinning so fast that they were a blur of red light. "You brought a guest to the heart, Elias," the mountain boomed. "The mountain thanks you. It has been hungry for a woman's song. "She's not for you, Miller," I said, standing between Maya and the engine, "and neither am I." I looked at Maya. "When I hit the center of the engine, don't look back. Just run toward the blue light in the rift. It will take you to the trailhead. You'll wake up in your car, and this will all be a bad dream." "I'll remember you," she whispered. "No," I said, my form beginning to dissolve into pure white light. "If I do this right, no one will ever remember me again, and that's exactly how it should be." I turned and sprinted toward the engine. I didn't just shove my memories into it this time. I shoved my entire existence. I became a supernova of human will in the center of the mountain's mindless logic. The engine didn't just stop, it imploded. The 16th day ended with a flash of light that could be seen for 50 miles. In the valley below, hikers looked up at the ridge and saw a pillar of white fire rising into the sky, then vanishing as if it had never been. Maya woke up in her SUV at the trailhead. The sun was shining. Her brother was in the passenger seat, complaining about the GPS. She felt a strange cold ache in her hand, but when she looked, there was nothing there, just a faint silvery smudge that vanished in the sunlight. Deep beneath Outpost 4, the cavern was silent. The engine was a pile of cold obsidian shards. Miller was gone, but in the center of the ruins, a single quartz-white figure remained. I am Elias, the man who broke the Appalachians. I am no longer a ranger, a ghost, or a shadow. I am the silence that follows the storm. But as the 17th day approaches, I can feel the stones above me beginning to pull themselves together. The mountain is rebuilding, it is learning, it is evolving, and it is very, very angry.
The final warning. The 18th day felt like the end of a long, fevered dream. I stood in the skeletal remains of Outpost 4, watching as the physical world attempted to reassert itself. The no time was fading, and the laws of entropy were making up for lost decades. Every time I breathed, though I no longer had lungs, the wood of the cabin turned a shade darker, crumbling into the soil. The mountain was silent. The woman from the lost valley, the engine, the screaming static of the radio, all of it had settled into a heavy, expectant hush. The ridge was waiting to see if I would fulfill my promise. I held the oilcloth map in my hands. It was the last tether, the final blueprint that allowed the human mind to find this specific, cursed coordinate in the vastness of the Appalachians. "It has to be done," I whispered. My voice didn't sound like dry leaves anymore. It sounded like the mountain itself, resonant, deep, and final. I walked out onto the porch. The gravel driveway was gone, reclaimed by thick, thorny briars that grew with a predatory speed. The white truck Caleb had left behind was a rusted husk, its tires melted into the earth, its windshield shattered by the weight of falling pine needles. I looked down at the valley, where the lights of the nearest town usually twinkled like a distant galaxy. They were gone. In their place was only a sea of mist, a barrier I had helped create. I realized then that Outpost 4 wasn't just a location, it was a frequency. And as long as that frequency was being broadcast, the Forest Service would keep sending men like me. They would keep sending the Calebs, the Millers, and the Mayas.
They would call it environmental protection or fire watch, but deep down the bureaucracy of the world knew it was a tithe, a sacrifice to keep the oldest mountains in the world from waking up and swallowing the sun. I sat on the edge of the rotting porch and spread the oilcloth map across my knees. The ink began to move. It wasn't red anymore. It was a shimmering golden liquid, the blood of the lost valley. The map was rewriting itself. It was no longer showing trails or ridges. It was showing a list of names. Every ranger, every surveyor, every lost hiker. I saw my own name at the bottom, Elias, day 18. The warning isn't for them, I said to the empty hair. The warning is for the mountain. I took the silver axe, the one that had been with me since the first night. It was no longer a tool of iron. It was a conduit of my remaining spirit. I didn't swing it at a tree or a monster. I swung it at the map. As the blade sliced through the oilcloth, a shockwave of white light erupted from the cabin. It wasn't a destructive blast. It was a silence. I felt the frequency of Outpost 4 snap. The coordinates in the Forest Service computers would now show an empty ridge. The GPS signals would skip over this valley as if it didn't exist. The very memory of this outpost was being pulled out of the human collective consciousness like a weed from a garden. But the mountain didn't take this lightly. The ground beneath me began to heave. The stones of the blind ridge began to scream, a high-pitched tectonic shriek that tore through the air. The shadow over the ridge reappeared, but it was no longer a silhouette. It was a physical wall of obsidian and ice, towering over the clearing, its blue fire eyes burning with a divine fury. "You would blind me, Elias?" the mountain roared through the wind. "You would cut the tongue from the ridge?" "You don't need a tongue to breathe," I shouted back, standing my ground as the porch collapsed beneath me. "And you don't need a witness to exist. Go back to the gold, back to the starlight. Leave the world of men to their short, flickering lives." I threw the tattered pieces of the map into the air. They didn't fall. They ignited, turning into white sparks that drifted into the woods, seeking out every symbol, every mark, and every journal entry I had ever seen. I was erasing the trail. The shadow reached out a massive, clawed hand made of uprooted hemlocks. It swept across the clearing, intent on crushing the cabin and me along with it. But as the hand approached, it slowed. The white sparks from the map touched the wood, and the shadow's form began to blur. By destroying the map, I had destroyed the shadow's permission to be physical. It was being forced back into the realm of raw data, back into the lost valley. The mountain let out one final mournful whistle, a sound that resonated from the depths of the Blackwood Marsh to the peaks of the Smokies. Then it was gone. The cabin was gone. The truck was gone. The clearing was gone. I stood in the middle of a dense, trackless forest. There was no Outpost 4. There was no road. There was only the ancient, indifferent beauty of the wilderness. I looked down at my hands. I was no longer a ghost. I was a part of the air. I was the scent of the rain, the chill of the morning frost, and the way the light hits the leaves in the late afternoon. I am Elias, the man who was the lock. I walked, or rather I drifted, to the edge of a small stream. I saw a hiker in the distance. He was young, wearing a bright orange backpack, looking at a modern paper map with a confused expression. He stopped, looked around, and shook his head. "I could have sworn there was a cabin on the ridge," he muttered to himself. He looked directly at me, but his eyes passed right through. He saw only a patch of particularly vibrant ferns. He turned around and headed back toward the main trail, away from the valley. He was safe. The tithe had been canceled. But as the sun began to set on the 18th day, I felt a familiar vibration deep in the earth. The mountain wasn't dead, it was just sleeping. And I realized that a lock only works as long as someone is there to hold the key. I am the final warning. I am the reason people feel a sudden, inexplicable chill when they hike too far into the hollows. I am the voice that tells them to turn back. My watch isn't over. It has simply become permanent. The 19th day is coming, and for the first time in a century, the Appalachians are truly wild again. But in the dark, where the limestone meets the roots, I can still hear the ticking of 1,000,000 clocks, and I know that somewhere the mountain is already dreaming of a new way to be seen.
The 19th day brought a light that felt earned. It was a soft, pale dawn that filtered through the canopy of a forest that was no longer a cage. I stood, if that word still applied to a consciousness woven into the wind, where Outpost 4 used to be. There was no timber left, no iron stove, no rotting journals. Only a circle of vibrant green moss marked the spot where the cabin had once held the ridge in a jurisdictional grip. The weight that had pressed against my soul since the first night was gone. The mountain was no longer hungry because I had become the meal that never ends. By dissolving my identity into the ridge, I had given the Appalachians exactly what they wanted: a perpetual observer. I drifted down toward the valley, passing through the forbidden trail. The trees there were no longer twisted in agony. They were just trees, their roots deep in the dark earth, their branches reaching for the sun. I saw the Blackwood Marsh, now nothing more than a quiet wetland where frogs sang a chorus that held no hidden names. The sleepers beneath the water were gone, returned to the cycle of the earth, their stories finally closed. As I reached the edge of the forest, where the wild land meets the paved roads of the human world, I saw a familiar sight. A white Forest Service SUV was parked at the trailhead. A man stepped out. He was older, his face etched with the weary authority of a man who had spent 40 years in the bureaucracy of the wild. He looked at a digital tablet in his hand, his brow furrowed in confusion. I recognized him from the files. This was the Chief Ranger, the one who had sent me and Miller and Walker before me. He walked to the edge of the woods and stared up at the ridge. He checked his coordinates again. He looked at the spot where Outpost 4 was supposed to be, a place that his records insisted existed, but his eyes could not find. "Gone," he whispered, his voice carrying a mix of fear and an odd hidden relief. "It's actually gone." He stood there for a long time, the wind, my wind, ruffling his gray hair. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a ranger's badge, identical to the one I had carried. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the thick brush. "Good luck, Elias, whoever you were." He got back into his truck and drove away, the tires kicking up dust that settled quickly back into the soil. He was the last one who remembered. From this moment on, the Forest Service would simply list the area as unprotected wilderness, a blank space on the map, a sanctuary. I returned to the high peaks as the stars began to emerge. I sat on the blind ridge, the limestone beneath me feeling like the skin of an old friend. I looked down into the lost valley, the golden light now a soft internal glow that hummed in sync with my own thoughts. The woman from the lake was there, standing among the glowing ferns. She looked up at me and smiled, a smile that held the warmth of 1,000,000,000 summers. She didn't need to speak. We were part of the same song now. I realized then that the horror of the Appalachians wasn't about the monsters or the mimics. It was about the fear of being forgotten. Every ranger who fought the mountain was fighting against the inevitable truth that we are all transient, all just a pulse in the vast heartbeat of the world. But I had found a way to stay. I am Elias, the silent watcher. I am the reason the mist feels like a hand on your shoulder. I am the reason the birds fall silent when a predator is near. I am the guardian of the secrets that lie beneath the roots. I am no longer afraid of the dark, because I am the one who keeps it. The 20th day will come, and the 1,000th day after that, and I will still be here. I will watch the continents drift. I will watch the stars shift. I will watch the forests grow and fall and grow again. If you ever find yourself hiking deep in the Blue Ridge, far past the marked trails and the cell phone towers, and you feel a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace, that's me. And if you feel a sharp, cold prickle on your neck that tells you to turn around and go home, that's me too. The watch is constant. The stones are set. And the fire finally belongs to the stars. The Appalachians are quiet now. The mountain is asleep, and its dreams are finally peaceful. My name was Elias, but now I am just the ridge. The end.